1st, 2016, Rabbi Pinchas Goldschmidt, the president of the Conference of European Rabbis, said in a speech before the European Parliament that the situation in Europe today for Jews is extremely dangerous. He said that Jews in Europe today feel as if they are standing in a dangerous track with two trains coming at each other with increasing speed. One train, he said, is the train of radical Islam and of Islamic terrorism. The other train, he said, is the anti-Semitism of the old right. Both trains, he added, are existential threats for the Jews, and both trains have to be halted before it's too late. Rabbi Goldschmidt is correct. Approximately 22%, or almost 1 in 4 Jews surveyed in 9 European countries, feel that they should avoid Jewish events and Jewish institutions for fear of attack. 40% of the 1,200 French Jews surveyed that they avoid wearing symbols such as yarmulkes or the Jewish stars of David around their necks for fear of an anti-Semitic attack. Fear of attack in Belgium is almost as great, where 36% of Jews feel that they should avoid wearing those symbols that identify them as Jews in public. Tens of thousands of Jews have emigrated out of France and Belgium, and thousands more are in the process. But this is not just about Jews. Western civilization in Europe is under attack. From the Madrid train bombings that killed 191 people on March 11, 2004, to the London Underground bombings on July 7, 2005, which killed 56, to the coordinated ISIS attacks in Paris in November of 2015, and there were many in between, at a soccer stadium and at a live Paris rock concert, massacring 130 people and injuring scores more. To the ISIS-coordinated bombing attacks in Brussels in March of 2016, 2 at the Zaventem airport and 1 at the subway station near the headquarters of the European Union. 2, the attack in Nice, France, in July of 2016 on Bastille Day, when a large crowd deliberately plowed into a large truck, deliberately plowed into a large crowd of people out celebrating their national July 4th, Independence Day, murdering 84 people and injuring hundreds more. 2, the most recent attack on December 19th, 2016, at a Christmas market in Berlin, claiming 12 lives and injuring scores more. I should say that this event today comes at a very timely moment in history when many of us have on the front of our head the thorny issue of trying to navigate through our civil liberties and our constitutional freedoms together with the protection of the American people. And this is not an easy thing to calibrate. But we have some wonderful people here to help us with that.
Thank you, Sarah. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. This is the warming up act before Lars Adaktusson will speak about the situation for Christians in the Middle East, which I understand is very much on the agenda here in the United States this very morning and in the last few days. But we believe there is a connection also into Europe and the problems that we are facing in Europe at the moment, and especially the Jewish communities, the Jewish minorities in Europe. And I think it's also relevant, the fact that our organization is, as Sarah mentioned, is a Christian initiative. And we believe it's important that we as Christian majority in Europe have a special concern for what we see happening on our continent at this very moment. Having said that, it's interesting to note that the only leaders that spoke up in time about the ongoing persecutions of Christians, Yazidis and other religious minorities in the Middle East were Jewish. And I would mention in particular our friend former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Ron Prosor, who was the first one to raise this issue in the Security Council. And I believe this is a beautiful way of working together as Christians and Jews on issues which are close to our heart. Let me also say that I'm joined today by our UN Director, Gregory Lafitte from France, who's sitting here up front, and Faith Collins Childress, who is our US representative working here in Washington. I would like to elaborate a little bit with you today about the situation in Europe at the moment for European Jewry. Looking at the background, looking at the situation today, looking at who are the perpetrators, and finally what can we do to address the situation. Last Friday marked the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it was 72 years since the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp was liberated. But still today, 72 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, Jewish people live in fear in Europe. And I think this statement in itself should be a matter for concern for all of us on this side of the Atlantic as well as in Europe. When we look at the background of European Jewry, we are talking about a history of 2,000 years. The Jews have always been with us in Europe, and it would be impossible to even imagine Europe and European civilization without the contributions of Jewish scholars and personalities, from Spinoza to Einstein to Freud, and the list goes on and on. It's also important to note, just on a historical note, that life has not always been difficult for the Jewish people in Europe. I'm thinking in particular about time in the Middle Ages in Poland, where some 75–80% of the world Jewry lived in that area, and where Poland was referred to as the paradise of the Jews because of its very liberal approach to religious minorities and to the Jewish communities in particular. But mostly and sadly, when we think about European Jewry, we think about darker ages in time, starting with the Crusades, the Inquisitions, the pogroms, and obviously culminating in the attempt of the Third Reich to get rid of all forms of Jewish life in Europe. But today, to put things in perspective, while Europe has experienced the largest mass immigration since the Second World War, there is one group of people who are leaving Europe in record high numbers, and that's the Jewish people. This is something that we don't often hear about in mainstream European media. And why is this the case? Just to look at some numbers, when we're speaking about France in 2015, it was the highest number since the end of the war. Some 8,000 people left France. I think to be fair, this year, for some reason, the numbers are lower, but nevertheless. Sarah mentioned already, or quoted from the most reliable source that we have in terms of perceptions among European Jewry themselves in different nations in Europe, how they themselves experience their situation. And it's interesting when we look at the timing of this survey, which is very alarming in itself. You mentioned a number of findings in that survey, which I'm not necessarily going to repeat. But to know that this happened actually before the recent wave of terrorist attacks in Europe. I think the tracking period for this survey was just after the Toulouse, the killing of innocent Jewish life in Toulouse, but before any of the major attacks in Brussels, in Copenhagen, and in Paris. And if you would ask the same questions today, obviously it goes without saying that the numbers would be much, much higher. This means, on a very practical note, what it means for European Jewry is that most Jews avoid displaying anything that would identify them as Jewish people. A large number are considering leaving Europe. So the question whether this long history of 2,000 years of European Jewry that didn't come to an end even with the Holocaust, I think there are serious questions now in Europe as to has the time come that would mark the end of Jewish life in Europe. And I think just to say a few words about the perpetrators. Obviously, we are looking at a resurrection of traditional neo-fascism, and we just know what have happened in the last few months, and we have elections coming up in France, in Netherlands, and in Germany, where Jewish leaders that I speak to in Europe feel a real concern that there is a polarization in society, and we see a resurgence also of neo-fascist anti-Semitic violence. It's perhaps also important to say, and that could be a matter of discussion as well, that not all, I think we need to differentiate. Not all forms of what we call nationalism or populism is necessarily anti-Semitic. And I think here we need to have a real conversation about, what are the red lines? And we also need to understand that even those who have a history of being anti-Semitic, be it a party itself, people can change. When I spoke with Jewish leaders in Brussels last week as well, this is what were their conclusions. If you look at the fascists in Spain after the war, they transformed under José María Aznar into a very respectable mainstream center-right party with a very strong support for Israel. The same could be said in Italy with Lega Nord and Mr. Fini. So I think as we had this discussion, because we had this polarization in society with this very little middle ground where we can be more nuanced, that we need to keep this in mind. Finally, perhaps, because we said we would just have an introduction and then there will be more time later, what can we do? I think there are at least 3 areas where in Europe we need to step up our work, and that is legislation, it's security, and it's education. On the security side, I think, speaking about France, they have done a lot already in trying to guarantee the protection of Jewish sites in France. Legislation, you know that legislation in Europe is more stricter than it is in this country when it comes to free speech and Holocaust denial. But education is absolutely vital in Europe, where we have a large segment of the Muslim immigration population which clearly stated anti-Semitic views. And it's absolutely vital that Holocaust, our European history, will be taught in schools all over Europe. And there should be no-go zones, which sadly has been the case that in certain schools this is an issue which cannot be raised by teachers. But we need to do more in terms of educating our next generation and those who are coming not from Europe but from outside. We need strong US support in this battle. as much as it relates to the next subject in the Middle East, but also in Europe. We are hoping that the new administration will continue to engage in international forums, being the OSCE, United Nations, together with the European Union. Secondly, I also think that we need to upgrade our understanding of anti-Semitism and new forms of anti-Semitism. I think, for example, that it's not acceptable to speak about Jews in Israel or in the disputed territories as obstacles to peace, and without to dehumanize a people group in such a terrible way. And this is something that we as an organization have raised on and on again, that this is a red line for us as well. We need to call the perpetrators by name and identify the theology, and I think it will benefit all parties if we have a more honest discussion also with the Muslim communities and with Islamic scholars. What does Islam really say about our attitudes to the Jewish people? And this should be a very clear signal from that community. But also, finally, we need to build. That was assigned to me. I need to stop. We need to build coalitions with moderate Muslims and other persecuted minorities in order to bring about a broader alliance. This is just a short intervention on a topic which is very complex and which is of great concern for us in Europe. But
dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you, Sarah, for the kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me to speak about this very important topic about the persecution of Christians. It's of course closely connected to the general situation, the political situation in the Middle East region. About 2 months ago, I visited the Nineveh plains of northern Iraq, the area where Christian groups, Syrians, Syriacs, Chaldeans, make up the indigenous population, where they have lived and where they have farmed the land for more than 1700 years. Just about 30 miles from the battlefield surrounding the city of Mosul right now I visited the recently liberated town of Karakosh, known for having been the largest Christian town in Iraq. In Karakosh, I participated in the celebration of the first Sunday Mass since the town was taken by ISIS in August 2014. The feeling of hope was tangible. Once again, the church bells were ringing. Once again, prayers and hymns were heard in Aramaic language. The historic Mass took place in a seriously vandalized and torched cathedral. What surrounded us was the signs of deliberate devastation and contempt for the beliefs of others. What we saw was the result of hatred and pure evil. Crushed holy symbols, ashes from books, burnings and damaged Bibles, ISIS graffiti on the ancient crosses and church walls. Christians are today the most persecuted religious group in the world. That's a fact. Islamic extremism is the most common force and motive behind this persecution. This is a fact that I believe needs to be brought to attention in order to stop it. In fact, it's possible to bring this to attention without downgrading the persecution of other groups. As a member of Foreign Affairs Committee and the Subcommittee for Human Rights within the European Parliament, I have for some time dealt with issues related to religious freedom. Due to the atrocities of ISIS, much of the work has been focused on the most vulnerable groups in the Middle East. Those groups who in Islamist and jihadist delusions are considered infidels and therefore should be subdued or killed. On several visits to the Middle East over the last 18 months, I have witnessed how critical the situation really is. The last fall, my political advisors and I went to Syria, we went to Iraq, and we went to Lebanon. In Beirut, we heard deeply heartbreaking accounts of abuse against Christian believers. A large number of refugees told us about lost relatives, murdered friends, rapes, kidnappings, enslavement. Sometimes it's claimed that the Christians of the Middle East, in a formal sense, are not subject to genocide, since they can escape persecution by paying an extra tax, as imposed by the Quran. But what we heard, what we were told by the refugees, was something completely different. Without exception, victims told us that they, through kidnappings, through threats, had been forced to convert to Islam or die. Invited by the patriarch of the Syrian Orthodox Church, we also visited war-torn Syria. In Damascus, we met with Christian leaders who had been kept hostage under appalling conditions by the ISIS. New stories about darkness, new stories about despair. 40 miles north of Damascus, we visited Malula, a historic town where the inhabitants speak Western Aramaic, a descendant of the language of Jesus. Malula was captured a few years ago by Islamist rebel forces, and now it's a ghost town. The population had fled, houses are destroyed, churches, monasteries demolished. Almost half of Syria's approximately 2 million Christians have been forced to flee due to persecution and violence. In neighboring Iraq, the situation is similar. The amount of Christians has decreased from 1.5 million 15 years ago to a couple of 100,000 today. The historic mosaic of religious and cultural diversity is about to be torn apart and shattered forever. In February of 2016, almost 1 year ago, I had the privilege to initiate a resolution in the European Parliament which recognized the atrocities committed by the ISIS as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. It has been amazing to see that this resolution, which by the way was supported by a broad majority in the House, has made a difference. After the recognition in the European Parliament, other parliaments have followed suit. For instance, the British House of Commons, the Australian House of Representatives, the French National Assembly, and not least important, the US Congress and State Department. I would say this is really significant, as the recognitions themselves are an affirmation of what the victims have suffered from, namely the worst and the most heinous crime under international law. The victims and their families' dignity addressed and somewhat and hopefully restored. But the recognitions of these different parliaments are important also in other aspects. Research shows that it's not until the word genocide is used that the international community reacts and takes action. At the same time, the possibility for a binding resolution of genocide by the UN Security Council increases. The door opens to legal procedure and to prosecution of the perpetrators through the International Criminal Court, ICC, or an ad hoc tribunal. And let me add, any steps taken in order to raise awareness about the ongoing genocide and the alarming situation for Christians will make a difference. Whether it concerns the need for reconstruction, demining, which is a huge issue, or security arrangement in the Nineveh area, or just making sure that the Christians are not forgotten, is of tremendous importance. I would also like to take this opportunity to underline the importance of a holistic perspective. To compel the UN to recognize genocide is indeed the key to secure the future of Christians in the Middle East. But alongside the work for binding international recognition, it's crucial also to secure the political rights for northern Iraq's indigenous peoples. As Mosul is yet to be fully liberated by the ISIS, yet to be driven out, and ISIS yet to be driven out of Iraq, there is now a window of opportunity to address the future for Christians and for Yazidis. Because the very moment when the last ISIS warrior has been hunted out of Mosul, the conflicting agendas of the different regional actors risk destabilizing northern Iraq, thus making the return of IDPs and refugees impossible. That is why I initiated a second resolution on northern Iraq that was passed by the European Parliament on October 27th of last year. The resolution expresses the need and support for maximum autonomy of the Nineveh Plain together with Tal Afar and Sinjar. These areas need to be self-sufficient provinces within, and this is important, within the framework of the Iraqi constitution. Together with security and protection, such a solution would create the conditions necessary for repatriation. Only under an autonomous system, fundamental human rights for Christians and other indigenous peoples can be restored and preserved. Actually, it was this resolution that led to my recent trip to Iraq, where I, in addition to the visit to the Nineveh Plains, also met with representatives of the Iraqi Christian political parties. It's well known that the relationship between these parties is characterized by political differences and disagreements. But obstacles were overcome and the meetings were successful. All parties signed an official letter urging the European Commission and the EU member states to act upon the recommendations of the resolution. Indeed, this is essential. For the 12 different Christian political parties in Iraq, it is a necessity to be united, because the EU, the US, the world at large won't do anything when it comes to political support, when it comes to reconstruction, unless they act together. As a next step, and I will conclude with this, my office is right now preparing an international conference for the Iraqi Christian stakeholders, political parties, church leaders, self-defense, manners, and NGOs. And we are doing this not because we want, but because the leaders of the Christian parties asked us for assistance. The aim with this conference will be to outline a joint Chaldean-Syriac-Assyrian approach in the fields of rebuilding and reconstruction, federalism, autonomy, and not at least security. The conference will be, hopefully, an important step to show the world that there is a constructive and reliable counterpart ready to take responsibility for the future of the Nineveh Plains, and accordingly securing the future for Christianity in the Middle East. United Nations Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief is Heiner Bielefeld. He has stated that human rights without the dimension of religion and belief has no meaning at all. This is indeed a message that needs to be brought to the corridors of Brussels, New York, and also Washington, D.C. Disappearances of Christians from the Middle East will mean the determination of indigenous groups from this region. Middle East, without its mosaic of peoples, will be a region rapidly going into a dark age, with no hope for peace and stability for a very, very long time. The Middle East without the Christians can no longer rely on a group which for centuries have been able to be a broker between different ethnic and religious groups. So my friends, assisting the victims of genocide, the vulnerable people of the Middle East, is the right thing to do. As political representatives, as church leaders and citizens, we need to realize that such assistance is also in our own interest. In the end, it's about standing up for value-based foreign policy, for human dignity, and for human rights. Thank you so much for this.
Do you have recommendations of how to balance this respect for religious freedom and knowing that among some of them might be terrorists? And we see what's happening in Europe to Christian and Jewish communities. And then on the same hand, we know that the most endangered people in the world are Christians coming out of the Middle East. So would you, and since President Trump has just made headlines by putting a moratorium of travel into this country from people from the Middle East, would you have any recommendations that you would like to make?
Thank you for the question. Let me first say a few words about the KRG, the Kurdish part of northern Iran, which you mentioned. And I fully agree that this region have made great efforts. They have militarily been fighting ISIS, and they have been also very generous when it comes to receiving IDPs and refugees. Over a night, more or less, during the summer 2014, they received approximately 1.5 or 1.8 million people coming from the Nineveh area and other areas where the ISIS forces came and drove these people away. So they have made great efforts, and we should be thankful for their efforts. We should certainly be that, and that's also an aspect of this now the need for a reconciliation process. I mean, when we are talking about the different stakeholders in this region, the Kurdish people are definitely one of those stakeholders. So when we now are organizing this conference that I mentioned, they will definitely be a very, very important part, and also a very important counterpart to these Christian groups to have a dialogue with. When it comes to your question, we had since quite a long time in Sweden have an immigration of refugees coming from Muslim countries. We have a tradition in Sweden with open borders, more or less, and with basic generosity against people who are fleeing from war and violence. And that has been, of course, a great asset for our country, since we are a small country. But we should also admit that this has brought new challenges and problems when it comes to integration, especially. Today we see concentrations of Muslim immigrants in some parts of Sweden, which cause some concern when it comes to the issue of anti-Semitism, for instance. These people coming, I think we should remember that they have been suffering from some kind of indoctrination or incitement from very low ages, from the children's program in television, through a school system, into the grown-up ages, where they have been fed by propaganda and anti-Semitic opinions. And then they come to our country, to Europe, and they have these images, and they have these values, and this very false, of course, images of Israel and the Jewish people. So we need to educate them, as Tomas mentioned. And we need to be much more active also when it comes to involve the leadership of the mosques and the Islamic community. We are working on that in Sweden, but we need to do much more because we see the result now, which is very, very concerning. The growing number of Islamistic hate crimes, for instance, anti-Semitic hate crimes, and also a growing problem in the Swedish school system with this. So it is a problem, and we need to do much more than we are doing.
Yeah, no, obviously what we've seen in Europe in the last 2 years is unprecedented. And I think it goes back to Germany, it goes back to one particular political leader who opened the gates, so to speak. And while I may understand her heart in doing so, and you may say it came from a tradition of Christian compassion, I would still be among those who would remain a little bit critical of the lack of any form of vetting. And I don't think it's a wise policy to avoid having a proper vetting. So, I mean, even here, going back to your new president, I think vetting as such is something we need to have to keep in place. So obviously this has changed the whole outlook of Europe, and I've said it publicly before, and I can say it again. I think if this would have been dealt with in a different way, we may not have seen the outcome of the Brexit and other sorts of problems that we see now within the European Union.
Are you aware of the situation in Europe?
Yeah, no, in the Middle East.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah.
I would say no. It's better today than before. That we have a long time of media reluctance, I would say. There have been not very much reporting about the situation. It has been very sensitive to report that the victims are Christians. and the perpetrators are Islamists. That is, in our political context, a sensitive matter to mention. But now I think, since the situation is that bad that it is, more and more people start to realize that this is a major problem, and this is a genocide going on, actually. So it becomes better, but still I would say there is a lack of knowledge and also a lack of engagement from different political parties and also from some of the churches actually in Europe.
Is there a fear to speak out from the pulpit about the issue?
In some instances it is, in some churches it is, but for instance in Sweden we have the big church is the Lutheran Church, and they have been very cautious, very quiet, because they want to, their policies are that if you mention Christians, you put them in confrontation with other religious groups, and therefore it's better to say nothing, which has been a devastating policy and which has been very much protests against, not at least from the suffering people in the Middle East.
Just to say, I think the general perception in Europe has always been that a Christian cannot be persecuted. A Christian, by definition, is privileged, is white, is wealthy. So this new understanding of that the majority of Christians in the world live in completely different circumstances is something that is only now starting to, the message is starting to sink in. But I think perhaps also, because we spoke about this just before the seminar started, that over the last 2 years and perhaps even over the last less than 1 year, there's been a gradual change. And I think one of the things that may have contributed to that was the brutal killing of this French priest in the north of France this summer, where suddenly French people realized that it's a problem to be a Christian, and who could be less threatening that a Catholic priest, an old Catholic priest. So things are changing. I just want to add something that because of time pressure, I didn't say, and I think it's important. And that is that when I said that there's now a real threat that this could be the end of Jewish life in Europe as we know it, and I did mention what I would call a new form of anti-Semitism, which is neither Islamic nor right-wing nor left-wing. I call it sophisticated anti-Semitism in the name of human rights.
Right, exactly.
And then you have the circumcision issue, you have the kosher. So I think the biggest threat to Jewish life in Europe actually comes from this very sophisticated, liberal, humanistic approach to say that, you know, if we have to choose between the rights of children or animals and the Jewish community, it's clear what we will choose. And there was this resolution from the Council of Europe already. So this is something I just want to highlight that I didn't want to leave without saying that.
Yes.
So when it comes to the European Union, I should also say that I think they played an active role. Just last year they appointed, for the first time ever, long overdue, a coordinator against anti-Semitism, Katharina von Schnurbein. She has her own website. She would always point out to say that when we are looking at legislation, the European Union does not have the competence to legislate in these areas. But they've had a few directives, sadly, which have not been implemented by the member states. So I think we have to realize that there are clear limitations as to what the European Union can do in terms of legislation. So this is something that needs to be, they can have a motivating force to the national capital, but they cannot make the decisions in Brussels for the EU 28. I think that's an important point to make.
Which is basically a general problem when it comes to EU policies, that you can have directives taken in the parliaments or directives from the Commission, but it ends up with the political will from the member states to implement these decisions. And from time to time there is reluctance and an unwillingness from the member states to follow these directives taken in Brussels. So that goes for many different political areas, and this is obviously one of them. But here we have a possibility as politicians and also as voters to put pressure on these governments within the different member states to live up to their own commitments.
Also experience that.
When it comes to Sweden, just very briefly, I fully agree. I would say that Sweden is perhaps the most hostile country towards Israel in Europe. Ireland is also one of those, but right now we have a situation on the political side that we haven't seen for many years, namely that our Swedish foreign minister is persona non grata in Israel because of different very appalling statements about Israel and about Jews. So we have no diplomatic contacts right now between Sweden and Israel. And this is the hostility, I would say, is a result of course, a lot of different reasons. But one of the main reasons, definitely, is that we, for many years, have had a very biased media reporting. The media tends to be very much left-leaning in Sweden since '68 and forward, and very anti-US. So I think it's a combination of this very left-leaning media, the hostility against Israel, and the US hostility as well, which has kind of been mixed up and ended up with reporting that has been very one-sided and very much focused on one issue, which is the Palestinian issue. So this is really a serious situation, since it has affected so much of the common knowledge about the situation, which is today, I would say, in a very bad shape, and people need to know more about the real things and the real situation. So, but this is one of the factors which I think is very important.
Well, it's one of those $1 million questions that we're trying to sort out. I must say I'm rather pessimistic, and I would say exactly as you were indicating that it goes very deep in the culture. And it's something that never really disappeared, but as you say, it was not accepted. You couldn't mention those things in civilized circles for many years. But I think what made it legitimate was, of course, once you brought in Israel in the equation. And then you had, in a way, an excuse to really get back at the Jewish people. And that also, to some extent, explains the amount of anti-Israelism in Europe, because it's a reformulation of hatred against the individual Jew, but now instead targeting the collective Jew. So and I think I've heard it a number of times. If you look at anti-Semitism as a cancer cell that mutates, so it means that it will always find an expression which is not the previous expression, because we have an immune system that can deal with that. But then it finds its new ways, and that's what I call sophisticated anti-Semitism, which doesn't come across as a very aggressive, radical extremism, but it's the source, sadly, I believe it's still the same. I think it's reflective of the whole general debate in Europe right now, where I think many people are starting to raise these questions, and in particular in Central and Eastern European countries, how this situation came about and why there were no consultations really on the EU level. So I don't think it's only an internal Catholic question, but something that concerns a lot of people, and maybe.
Well, I think it's from my point of view, as I said, also my party and the movement that I represent, the Christian Democratic movement in Europe, has tried to focus on values and human dignity and the right for all people to apply for asylum, to flee from war and violence. That have been the foundation in this policies, and I think that has been, as Tomas said before, mentioned before, that has been understandable, and it's been in many instances, in many cases, the right policy. If you agree fundamentally to these values, but on the other hand, we have a reality now which is really complicated, more difficult than it has been before. We have international terrorism, which is we work a lot in order to confront and to control, and we have not been very successful when it comes to situation in Europe, for instance, if you see over the last 12 months. So, of course, this is a very, very difficult balance. Personally, I don't believe in closed borders. I believe in more effective border controls, and I also believe in a bigger responsibility among the European 28 member states in Europe to share the responsibility and to show solidarity with the real victims of war. But I don't want to have terrorists coming into Sweden and to Europe, of course. Again, it's not a good answer maybe, but it underlines the complexity of the issue. Tomas.
Well, I mean, you are putting your finger on the critical. I mean, it's perception is everything, and it's true to be on the wrong side of this debate whether to let in people or not. It's not easy to make your point in a civilized way, and I think what we are lacking, and I think Lars is one of the exceptions perhaps, is a moderate centrist point of view, because now it's very polarized, and we have the rise of extremist parties, Le Pen in France, who give very clear black and white answers to questions which are complex. So I think what we need is really a credible center-right alternative. But I also do see this, coming back to another question, over the last 1 year there has been a change, I think, in Europe, and we are slowly waking up, and I think the language used in Europe over the last 1 or 2 years have been even clearer than in the past administration here in Washington. So in that respect, I'm not ashamed of European policy, let's put it this way.
I would also like to add, if it's at all possible, that we in AMET tend to adopt dissidents from Muslim-majority countries who have risked everything to speak out and to tell the truth about radical Islam and what they've been through. And one of them is a dear friend of mine, Akad Al-Hende, who is a Syrian Christian. And he has said to me that there are a number of churches, very few churches, that are left in Syria, and they know who their members are. Now, these people should be put ahead of the rolls to get in here, because they are the ones that are truly being persecuted. And sometimes when we just let in, Syrians, it's like letting in Germans during World War II. Nobody wanted to be in a war zone, as opposed to, just plain, just looking at the Jews and the people that were being persecuted by the Nazis. So if there's a way to do that, that would certainly be helpful to us. So, yes.
Maybe I could just add briefly. I think what the Australians, I know they've been criticized for a lot of things, but if you use everything has to do with how you communicate. If you speak about most vulnerable groups, clearly during the Second World War, just before, it was the Jewish people, and it was not put into question. And I think we should be able to make the case today, as Lars is doing, that there are the most vulnerable groups in this region that per definition are targeted. And we shouldn't be ashamed to say this. And I think this is what was lacking for many years in Europe in the whole debate. You could not say that. And that's where we started to run into problems.
Well, it's a very, very good question and a very, very special situation right now when we have to deliver to these groups what we have promised to help them. This resolution that we passed in October, end of October, was a very good foundation or start for a process which I believe, honestly, I believe very firmly that this is the only way forward to support a political process which gives these groups an autonomous system under which they can live and under which they will be able to go back from these ancient areas where they come from. So we have this resolution as a start. We have a consensus among the parties in the European Parliament that we would support this. And we, of course, hope that we will get the support also from the US. And I know there is a pending resolution in the House of Representatives right now, which is dealing with these issues. And the draft text that I've seen is very much reminding about the text that we passed in the European Parliament. So if we can reach an agreement between the European side and the US, I think that would be a very, very strong signal and a very good start when it comes to all the practical problems that we need to face. Reconstruction is a huge project. Rebuilding and I mean, it's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of political will to do this. But we have no other option. That's the fact. And that's why we will continue to work with this. And during my visit here in the US now, I'm going to meet with representatives of the Congress, but also NGOs and others who are really active and who are really important in this process. So we are not alone.
But I just wanted, are people aware that the United States has serious congressional support for this, and there is a special advisor for religious minorities in the Middle East and South Central Asia? Because there's a person, his name is Knox Thames, and he's had that job for over a year.
And he's doing an excellent job. I met with him several times.
So, I mean, I think it's important to note that the U.S. government has been committed. We've had meetings with, governments as well as civil society. Knox has gone to Europe to talk with Parliament, not only on, the persecution of Christians, but the preservation of cultural and religious heritage. So I just wanted to say that because I didn't want people to think that our government is not.
Both Knox Thames and Ambassador Saperstein have made great efforts, and we have been working very closely with them. And I'm going to meet with Knox tomorrow, so I will report from that meeting on my website.